Good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. The U.S. is experiencing an affordable housing crisis that is expected to worsen as the effects of COVID-19 continue to reverberate. This webinar will address the current work by community and economic development organizations to address housing challenges using cooperatives, as well as policy barriers and opportunities going forward to address the shortage of affordable housing. I'm John Torres with NCBA CLUSA, and before we get started, I've just got a few housekeeping notes. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and participants' audio will be muted for the duration of the webinar. Now, if you have a question, please type it into the question box located in your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll be monitoring the question box during the presentation, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those questions as possible during the question and answer session. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be shared via email in the next few days. Now, to get things going, I'll introduce you to our moderator, NCBA CLUSA's President and CEO, Doug O'Brien. Hey, Doug.
Thank you, JT, and welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking some time today for this really important conversation at this critical time, as JT mentioned. Thank you for joining the National Cooperative Business Association, CLUSA International, for today's conversation on housing co-ops as a part of the affordable housing solution. NCBA CLUSA is an apex association for all kinds of cooperatives here in the United States, including credit unions, farmer cooperatives, rural electric cooperatives, and food co-ops, worker co-ops, and beyond. We also do international development globally. Included in our ranks of membership are housing cooperatives and its national group, the National Association for Housing Co-ops. As we turn to a new Congress and a new administration, we're very focused on making sure policymakers understand how the cooperative business model can help build more inclusive local economies and tackle some of today's greatest challenges. Today, we're focused on housing. Now, I'm just going to repeat very quickly a bit of logistics that John took us through. So after remarks from today's panelists, we'll have time for questions and comments. NCBA staff will be tracking the submissions throughout, so please feel free to add comments and questions in the chat box on a rolling basis, or just go ahead and email us at info@ncba.coop. info@ncba.coop. So just a minute to set the stage. Like all co-ops, housing co-ops are user-owned and controlled by the people who use the business. In housing co-ops, they empower people through stability, financial ownership, and governance authority in their housing. We wanted to host this conversation to provide insights on the many different shapes that housing co-ops can take so that it meets the needs of its community, including affordability, size, demographics, and geography. Today, we'll focus on limited equity housing cooperatives, resident-owned communities, and student housing co-ops, as well as the financing mechanisms to make this housing option possible. Communities and public officials are shifting their focus back toward ownership and wealth building opportunities and are turning to co-ops for their low barriers to entry, affordability, and long-term sustainability. Importantly, as you'll hear, they're a safe way for investment for financial institutions and governments. When 10 million people lost their homes in the wake of the 2008 foreclosure crisis, 0 limited equity housing co-ops foreclosed. And each year, housing co-ops have a vacancy rate of about 1%. People love living in housing co-ops with housing security, not at the whim of a landlord or an investor, and all the while they earn equity. So let's jump into today's conversation. First, I'm going to check to see, I'm just going to mention who's with us today. We have Casey Fannin, who's the President and Chief Lending Officer at the National Cooperative Bank. We have Kim Garmany, who's the Executive Director from College Houses, Danielle Maiden, who is a Program Manager with NeighborWorks Montana, and Andy Riker, the Executive Director with the Urban Homesteading Assistance Board. So I'm just going to check to see And I think we're going to go ahead and invite Danielle Maiden to present first on her experience with resident-owned co-ops in Montana. Danielle, welcome.
Thank you. So I have a few slides to bring up. And as we said, I am Danielle Maiden from NeighborWorks Montana. I am the Resident-Owned Communities Program Manager here, and we are a NeighborWorks organization that serves the entire state of Montana. If we could go to the next slide, please. NeighborWorks Montana is a NeighborWorks affiliate here, and we have a few different program areas. We provide housing counseling and education through our partner organization across the state. We are a HUD intermediary. We also are a CDFI and have lending and the resident-owned communities program, as well as we administer the Northwest Montana CLT here in Kalispell, Montana. Next slide, please. A few of the challenges that we're really facing here in Montana, I think we see a lot of this across the country. We're 40th in the nation for housing affordability. Our housing values are quite high compared to the cost of wages here. 30% of homeowners and 42% of renters are cost burdened, spending more than 30% of their income on housing here in Montana. The barriers to affordable housing are even higher for Native Americans and people with disabilities. And through the last 9 months, we have seen an even larger shift for housing affordability. Because of COVID, we're finding that many people who reside in urban areas are opting to move to somewhere more rural with more open space, and Montana has been on their list possibly for a while, and this has been a push for them to move here. So there's been a large migration of out-of-state buyers and renters buying homes sight unseen and moving here to Montana. We already had a pretty low inventory in the state, particularly in our more populated centers, Kalispell, Missoula, Billings, Bozeman, Great Falls, and Helena. And that's even more strained at this time because of that influx of folks. Next slide, please. So here in Montana, we see 15% higher home prices than the median home value across the country. 29.5% of Montana residents are housing cost burden. 60% of our manufactured home parks in Montana have 24 units or less, or are small parks, and that is out of the 469 total housing communities here that are manufactured housing. 4.5 is the median housing value in Montana, 4.5 times greater than the median wages of Montana. So really, folks are making quite a bit less money here, and a lot of what is played into that is that there is a lot of investment from out of state coming in to buy these homes, and so they can afford the housing prices, bringing up those values, where the local folks who live and work here can't afford those any longer. Next slide, please. So what we're doing to answer these issues is our statewide partnership for education on housing counseling, emergency housing assistance program with the Montana Housing, with the CARES Act funding that came through with the state. We were able to partner with them to help folks apply for the housing assistance funds with the state of Montana, so they dropped a barrier of being able to get those applications placed. We do single family lending, we do development lending through our CDFI as well, and we have our resident-owned communities program helping folks who live in manufactured housing buy their communities and run them as cooperatives. We administer the community land trust here in Kalispell, and we partner with a statewide land trust called Trust Montana as well. Next slide, please. So we are an affiliate of Rock USA, that is a national program. They are now in 22 states. There are 18,000 homes that have been converted into resident ownership using the ROC model. This is a good map showing where the affiliates are located and what states are being served currently. The resident-owned communities program has different affiliates like NeighborWorks Montana who are on the ground and able to help negotiate purchase and sale agreements with owners of manufactured housing communities. And then we get out on the ground and start visiting with residents and helping them organize to be able to form a cooperative and purchase their own community and run it as a cooperative with a board of directors that governs the day-to-day business. For this program, we work with Rock USA, and they have a CDFI as well that is a lender on all of these deals. And so there is financing available for resident ownership specifically. If you can please give me the next slide. Here in Montana, we have been doing the ROC program for about 11 years, and we have helped 14 communities convert to resident ownership. It's a total of 577 households across the state. We have brought $20.3 million in acquisition financing in those projects. As you can see, a challenge for us is that we live in a very large state, and being able to administer a program like the resident-owned communities program can be challenging to help represent the entire state. CNC in Billings is about 9.5 hours from our Libby Creek community. And so being able to provide technical assistance to these communities can be a challenge with the distance. We have, oh, let's go to the next slide, sorry. So as I had mentioned before, the manufactured housing is the only non-subsidized affordable housing in our country. And so we really want to be able to save this stock of housing. And here in the state, we have over 400 parks, and 60% of those are small parks. And typically we are able to work with Rock USA to get parks of 24 units or more financed. And because of in Montana having so many small parks, we got creative and started working with some local lenders to finance deals for smaller parks. So this here is one of our parks here in Kalispell that is 12 units and 11 units, and it was our first small community that we were able to convert to resident ownership. And here we now have 2 small resident-owned communities. And so they have 12 units and 11 units in those 2 parks. Next slide, please. Another issue, as you could see in our slides, is that housing affordability is a large issue, and we have a ton of tourism in specific areas. And about a year ago, I had a owner reach out to me that he would like to sell his park in Livingston, Montana, which is just about 50 miles from the gates of Yellowstone and very close to Bozeman and the Gallatin Valley. That is a sought after area with very high costs of living in it. And so we were able to get really creative on this. This has 48 units of manufactured housing and 33 units of apartments, which is definitely out of our typical wheelhouse working in resident ownership. And we were able to work with a local lender and a local community action agency to purchase this community. And in the future, we plan to ground lease the apartments, and the community action agency will renovate the apartments and keep them as an affordable workforce housing stock in the community, while the residents are able to run the manufactured housing park as a resident-owned community. Next slide, please. For our CLT here in Kalispell, we were able to work The CLT was able to work with the city of Kalispell and get NSP dollars through the 2008 housing crisis, and they were able to purchase 55 homes that were foreclosed upon in 2008, renovate them, and sell them as part of a community land trust called the Northwest Montana CLT. Currently, the CLT is looking at expanding into other parts of Flathead County. The average cost of a home here in Flathead County is $626,000. And there's been a 31% increase of home sales from 2019 to 2020 here in this valley. So it's really important for them not only to maintain the affordability and perpetuity with the 55 homes, but they'd really like to see that grow in the county to increase more affordability here. Next slide, please. All right, and we partner with Trust Montana. I'm on their board of directors, and this is a really creative organization that has created a statewide land trust instead of being in one geographic location like a city or county. They have been able to create a statewide model. And really one really great creative partnership that they have had is with Habitat for Humanity, both of Gallatin Valley and of Helena. And they have worked with them to donate the land into the land trust of a Habitat home. And so it remains affordable in perpetuity. Next slide. All right, that's all I have.
All right. Thank you, Danielle. That's just a fantastic example of strategies in a geography like Montana, and that's some of these strategies relatively new. So next, we're going to go to Andy Reichert, who's joined us from the Urban Homesteading Assistance Partnership in a different geography in New York City. And Andy has been leading this work for decades, actually, and can tell us a story about limited equity cooperative housing. So, Andy, if you could join us now, come on down. You can bring your camera up. Yeah, I hear you.
Okay, am I here?
We can see you too. Good to see you, Andy.
Okay,
All right.
Thank you. I was lost in webinar land somewhere for a while. Anyways, I'm happy to be here. I'm here to talk to you about limited equity co-ops and our organization, Urban Homesteading Assistance Board, otherwise known as UHAB. I'm going to start with a brief description of UHAB and our history, a little bit about what we know about limited equity co-ops, and then go on and talk a little bit about some national research we've done and what we found out about co-ops, limited equity co-ops nationally. So to start out, UHAB is a New York City organization. We were originally sponsored and still nominally sponsored by the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. For those of you who've been to New York, it's a very large cathedral up in Upper Manhattan. We started almost 50 years ago when New York City was experiencing abandonment. There were thousands of buildings that landlords were walking away from, not paying their taxes, not paying their water and sewer bills, lots of arson for profit and other things going on in New York City neighborhoods. And these were the exact same neighborhoods that had been redlined in decades earlier. There were lots of responses to it, and the city's response was to ultimately take the buildings from the landlord because they weren't paying their taxes. And so in the early years, the city waited 10 years to take the buildings. The buildings were vacant. Our response was to help people take over, groups of people who wanted to take over housing in their neighborhoods, vacant buildings, fix them up with their own sweat equity. And a process known as urban homesteading became possible, and using sweat equity as their down payment, buildings were rehabbed using a variety of city financing and money from the residents, and ultimately several hundred co-ops were created out of these thousands of abandoned buildings. As time went on, the city took the buildings quicker, and many of them came to the city as occupied buildings. And so we helped the city create a program, and then worked with the residents of buildings who wanted to take over buildings and run them. And we would provide training and technical assistance. And ultimately, the city would do repairs, fix up the buildings, and the residents would buy them for a nominal price as a limited equity cooperative. And over 1,000 of these buildings were created. And in some other programs, these vacant buildings, or more likely these partially occupied buildings, were turned over to us and others for various development programs where they would be rehabbed and then turned over to the residents at an affordable price as limited equity co-ops. Over the last 47, 48 years, almost 50 years, over 1,300 of these co-ops have been created with 30,000 units of housing. And this is all limited equity housing. Residents who live there pay $250 or more recently $2,500 to own their shares in the co-op, and they operate them as affordable housing. In addition, in New York City, we have tens of thousands of units, hundreds of projects that are large developments built in the previous decades, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and they're known as Mitchell-Lama co-ops. And there are 60,000 units of those, the largest of which is Co-op City, which has 15,000 apartments in it, and in one cooperative sort of development. So there's lots of limited equity co-ops in New York City. One of the things that we learned through the decades of our experience, that while developing a co-op and going through the process of creating a co-op is a lot of fun, the actual work of cooperative housing is sort of people development, that working with groups of people to make them a strong co-op, a strong board of directors, to have good co-op leaders, to be able to run their building for the next 50 years. And we learned that part of our job is to provide ongoing training and support, economies of scale kinds of purchase programs, such as buying insurance, buying fuel, and those sorts of things, to support the co-op so that they can remain affordable in the future, and be sustainable as affordable housing for the residents who live there. And one of the things that it got us thinking about was what happens elsewhere. What about co-ops from around the country? From time to time, we would be asked by a co-op from another city or a community group interested in co-ops from another state to look at co-ops. But about 5 or 6 years ago, we actually received a grant from a foundation to actually go out and look for the limited equity co-ops around the nation and see what was the state of the world of limited equity co-ops and how we could serve those limited equity co-ops and how we could grow the number of limited equity co-ops in the United States. At that time, it was believed that there were 425,000 units of limited equity co-ops around the country. 100 or 1,000 or more of those were, or more than 100,000, almost half of those were in New York City, but the rest were spread across the nation. And so we went out to look for those co-ops, and taking the original list of the 425,000, we went out and found databases, we talked to organizations, we found people who were involved in creating co-ops through the decades. And what we discovered is that, in fact, the 425,000 was an estimate, and it overestimated in some areas. And for instance, it counted UHAB of having created 50,000 units, and we only had 30,000 units, and it counted Co-op City 15,000 units twice, and other issues like that. So in fact, something over 300,000 units had existed in the United States. But by the time we started looking in 2016 and 2017, almost half of those units had been lost because the loans and the insurance programs, mostly federal, under which they were restricted as affordable co-ops, had expired. They had lived out their 20, 30, 40 years of regulation, and now they were without regulation. Didn't mean they weren't co-ops anymore. Almost all of them are still co-ops. And it didn't mean they weren't still affordable, but they were as affordable as co-ops were in their neighborhood. And if their city started seeing a big rise of housing costs, gentrification going on, then the cost of those co-ops could certainly rise and they wouldn't become more affordable. So we found the units, we found their address. There's actually a map and a database with all of them, and we can supply the website where you can find that. And we then started surveying them. And we also found about 100 organizations and individuals who worked and supported these co-ops, and we mapped and surveyed them as well. There's a couple things we found out. One is that over half of the 170,000 remaining units are vulnerable to losing their limitations and regulation in the future. And they, again, can be lost as limited equity co-ops at some time in the future. So they're not permanent. The other thing we learned is co-ops are desperate for co-op specific financing to finance repairs and upgrades, to help low income and moderate income individuals buy shares in their apartment in the co-op so that they can own their apartment, and that they also were interested in finding professionals and other sorts of help. And so we set about saying that we ought to try to figure out a way to meet these needs and a variety of other needs that we found in our survey. And we've begun to try to build a web platform and other ways in which we can join people together, join co-ops and the co-op practitioners through something that we call the Sixth Principle Coalition. And so that's where I will, seeing Doug appearing again, that's where I will stop and look forward to questions. Thank you.
Andy, thanks for that history. And I find such a fascinating, important history of you have using the cooperative business model kind of in that moment and then continuing that legacy to create impact through today. Really important observations on your research. I think I'm looking forward to, toward the end here, we'll come back around and talk a little bit more about the policy. And you've suggested a few things about policy that enables and policy that that hinders people from using cooperatives in the housing market. So thank you, Andy. So from New York City, let's go now to Austin, and let's hear from Kim Garmany. Kim is the executive director of College Houses, and she's going to talk about the co-op housing and the co-op business model in what certainly is also real challenges in affordability, and that's within college housing. So Kim also serves and has been a longtime board member for NCBA CLUSA. So we appreciate your leadership in this space and look forward to your comments. Kim.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Doug. Howdy, y'all. In addition to College Houses and NCBA, I also currently serve as the president of NASCO Development Services. And NASCO is the North American Students of Cooperation, which is our umbrella organization. So student housing co-ops, a lot of times we think about them just as student housing co-ops, but actually, just like we've heard in other presenters' speeches, there's an ownership model also. And we just heard about limited equity co-ops. And so student co-ops are usually, most of them are nonprofit organizations that are managed cooperatively by their members. So there's not really one agreed upon term for that, but a couple of terms that we like to use: group equity, shared equity. Some people say zero equity cooperatives. So when our members live with us, they pay their deposit or their shares, and then that grants them all of the rights and responsibilities of living in a cooperative. College houses specifically, we were created in 1964 as an educational community that switched to the cooperative business model as we purchased buildings and began owning our own property. So we've been in the community for more than 50 years. We have 532 members, and right now we specifically serve students, but in just a minute I'll talk about how we've had to shake things up a little bit since COVID. So I want to talk kind of about past, present, and future of the student co-op housing movement. So in the past, we see, there's student housing co-ops all across the United States and Canada. And we saw a lot of those come into being around times of economic depression, war, crises in our countries, in a way that people needed access to housing whenever they were accessing higher education. So that's whenever we see really big developments, and Doug likes to talk about the cooperative moments. We're living in one right now. Well, we see a lot of our student co-ops being developed in those other cooperative moments through history. We saw a big wave of those student housing co-ops developed in the 30s and then in the 60s. And we're seeing another new wave of development here in the last 10 or so years. In the 60s, whenever college houses, like I said, we switched to an ownership model from our educational communities. It was through a program called the College Housing Program, and it was through HUD. And many of the larger co-op systems, the student co-op systems here in the United States, accessed that program to be able to buy their properties. And that's kind of what made some of the bigger systems. You're looking at Austin, Berkeley, Ann Arbor. Those are the three biggest ones, and then mostly around university towns, as you can imagine. And so a lot of, in the 60s, a lot of the cooperatives were found, on the social values and aspects of cooperative living: sustainability, community, being able to have a voice for yourself. And while affordability was important, it wasn't the most important. The social aspects of student housing cooperatives were probably the most important. So that's kind of in the 60s, whenever a lot of them developed more on the social side. And in the 90s, we saw kind of this movement from student housing co-ops or group equity housing co-ops move from just students into community co-ops. And so like for the resident-owned communities, the community housing expansion of Austin, they're one of the affiliates, and their organization grew out of the student co-ops, and they also do group equity housing. So we have seen the group equity model being taken out of the student realm and into the community, in which I want to talk about that in a little bit too. So presently, like I said, there's some larger systems around the US and Canada. There's smaller houses, individual, independent co-ops. We are, like I said, we are members of NASCO, and so NASCO is the main organization that represents group equity housing co-ops in North America. Let's see. The main benefits for students in this type of living, I already touched on it a little bit, those social benefits, the community, having a support system, those are really obvious. But some of the ones that you might not think of right away, or maybe you have, is leadership development, providing stability during a transitional period in young adults' lives, real world skills acquisition, like sweeping the floor and cooking dinner, civic engagement. Most of the big student co-ops, they're run democratically, so one member, one vote, and the members are voting, how to use their budgets. So that's where the economic participation comes in. Apart from the deposit, there's no financial investment from our members, but rent, of course, but they are engaged and have ownership over many different aspects of our organization. we actually like to say, in one of our core values here at College Houses, is whenever you live in a group equity housing co-op, it's less about ownership and more about stewardship, because that implies the ownership, but it also implies that because our housing co-ops are permanently affordable because they belong to the nonprofit, that while our members live here, they're stewards, and they're preparing our cooperatives for the next generation of members that need them. So that's kind of presently where we are. I mean, before COVID. And then when COVID hit, we did, of course, across the United States, we saw universities closing left and right. And so many of the student co-ops were hit pretty hard. We lost half of our members in a week. And our group, our board of directors, which is made up of our members, so the bulk of our board is between 18 and 24 years old, they just hunkered down and started making changes and adapting and figuring out how we were going to move forward. And some of the things that we've done, as well as other co-ops have done to help our members through this time, is created resilience fund to help members with direct rent assistance. We've modified our operations to make sure that we're following safety guidelines. We've really leaned on one another, the leaders, the staff leaders in the student co-ops. We meet regularly to make sure that we're supporting one another and trying to figure out how we're all going to make it through what is going on right now. So another thing that has happened because of our extremely low occupancy, we did have to close one of our buildings, and that actually opened up an opportunity for us to see where else we can apply this cooperative business model. So we are currently in a partnership, and we haven't talked about this widely because we are in the partnership, and we will be ready to talk about it very broadly in the future, next year possibly. But we've partnered with the Ending Community Homelessness Coalition here in Austin, which is the body that does all of the coordinated entrance services for folks transitioning out of homelessness. And so we have partnered with ECHO to house youth transitioning from homelessness in one of our buildings that was no longer able to be supported by our student members. It has been an amazing learning experience, and many of the benefits that we see that our student members get have been even more impactful to these young adults transitioning from homelessness. The stability of housing, the control and agency over their lives and their living environments. It's been amazing and difficult, and we'll be excited to talk about it in the future. And so as far as the future is concerned, I really see that what we're trying to do in the student co-op world is preserve the housing that we have, make sure that we're going to be able to house the next generation of student co-opers, and then as we move forward, seeing where else that group equity model is going to fit, what other demographics can we serve, how can we deepen our impact and really use this cooperative business model as a leverage and tool for affordability. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim. And that last point about how to use this innovative but tried and true business model, the cooperative business model, to deal with housing challenges, affordability primarily, but then other challenges. I think that's we're really seeing a great set of examples today. Kim, you provided us a number of great examples. So just a housekeeping note, reminder to please put your questions or comments in the chat, and we'll tee those up, and I'll be able to ask the panelists after we hear from one more speaker. And I want to introduce to Casey Fannin, the President and Chief Lending Officer for the National Cooperative Bank. He is going to talk to us about lending to housing co-ops, obviously, and we've heard it alluded to a couple times here, just how critical it is to have decent financing options for people who want to use cooperatives in housing. And then Casey's going to probably tee up some policy conversation that may go into our question and answer as well. So Casey, please take it away.
Thanks, Doug. Good afternoon, everybody. As Doug said, I'm Casey Fannin, President of National Cooperative Bank. We are a cooperative bank ourselves, and we have a lot of housing cooperative shareholders at NCB. We do provide financial products and services across the country. and housing is a very important sector for us. So today I thought I'd sort of hit the highlights of co-op finance and the aspects of co-op finance. Speak for a moment on the success of co-op lending and the loans that banks and other agencies have in the co-op space and how they do. And then, as Doug said, we'll go into maybe some policy ideas or some discussion about how we can promote more co-op development, particularly limited equity co-op development across the country. So to start, there are really two primary aspects of co-op finance. The first is a share loan. The share loan is very similar to a single-family mortgage. It's the consumer who is the borrower, and it's very similar and has traditional metrics as I think anyone taking a single-family mortgage loan out that wasn't a cooperative. FICO, debt to income, loan to value, the ability to repay, including maintenance fees. These are all metrics that most consumers expect and are familiar with. There are a couple unique aspects to share loan lending because of the fact that it's within a cooperative. And first is there's this concept of project approval. Before a lender will lend to an individual to purchase shares in the cooperative, there's usually a review of the co-op itself to make sure that the co-op is sound, make sure, for example, that the insurance is properly in place, and make sure that financially the cooperative can support itself. So that is called project approval, and it's an important step really that you do before you lend into a cooperative. And generally you review that annually to make sure that the cooperative is solid. Legally, there's a little bit of a difference between a share loan and a home loan, single family mortgage. And it's because, in fact, it's called a share loan because the collateral for the bank is a share in the cooperative. The cooperative owns the real estate and the member owns a share in the cooperative. So the legality of it is a little different. For all practical purposes, it's the same. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and they all consider share loans very common. But I think we find that outside of the concentrated areas of co-op housing, New York is the perfect example, it becomes less common knowledge as you go further and further out of these heavy co-op spaces. I think most nationwide lenders have a co-op program, but as you get into smaller markets, I would say smaller lenders may not have the full understanding of how to do a co-op share loan. In NCV, for example, our market share generally tends to be higher in these smaller markets because there are fewer local banks that know how to do them. The second important piece of the co-op financing puzzle is the underlying mortgage. You know, as I mentioned, the co-op owns the real estate, the co-op corporation. And so accordingly, the co-op is the borrower for an underlying mortgage. And that mortgage, that loan to the co-op corporation is supported by the fees that the members pay to the cooperative. And this financing is more similar to a commercial transaction in the sense that similar to an LLC owning a building, the co-op owns the building. So from a legal perspective, it's more similar than different in that loan structure. There are differences though, and I would say bigger differences in the operational and underwriting aspects of an underlying co-op mortgage. And the biggest difference is the fact that co-ops generally operate to a break-even cash flow. And so if lenders who are not in this space look at these transactions, they can get confused or scratch their head about, you know, how you could have an underlying mortgage that breaks even at a one-to-one cash flow. So that operationally is important because, you know, co-ops are trying to limit their costs, and there's no profit motive for a housing co-op, so that break even makes a lot of sense. And importantly, because they're operating on pretty thin margins, we look at reserve analysis to make sure that co-ops have a rainy day fund of some, you know, cash in the bank or a line of credit that can really get them through any unanticipated expenses. And then, so really understanding the cash flow, understanding the reserve, and then the collections. The co-ops pay their underlying mortgage with maintenance fees, so it's important to understand that. And I wanted to draw the distinction between how these two play with interact with each other, the share loans and the underlying mortgage loans. I would say that on a market rate cooperative, it's more common to see the share loans have an outsized place within the capital structure than the underlying mortgage. On limited equity transactions, it's much more common to see the underlying mortgage be much greater than the share loans. And so I think we'll get into that in a minute, but essentially the shift of that debt from the individual to the co-op allows for those buy-in rates or those purchase prices that the other panelists spoke of $2,500 or the zero equity co-op. It's really a shift of that debt from the consumer to the cooperative. And so how do these loans perform? They're different. We think they're better, and we have data to show that they perform better. I would argue that underlying co-op mortgages are really the strongest asset class out there in real estate. We've got many loans. We've got a large business in this space, and those loans perform outstanding very well and have for decades. Share loans similarly outperform the market. Share loans do tend to follow because it's a consumer loan, and life happens. When delinquencies rise in the market, generally share loans delinquencies rise as well, but at a smaller portion. Our own portfolio outperformed during the Great Recession, and currently with deferrals and forbearances due to COVID, our forbearances and deferrals are less than half of the Fannie Mae nationwide metrics. It's proven to be, both on the underlying and share loan, a more resilient marketplace. And one of the reasons is you've got that kind of horizontal credit support. You've got 100 units in a property, 1, 2, or even 5 owners struggle. You've got 95 other cooperators there to help get the cooperative on its feet and on the right path. So that's how the loans are structured. What are considerations for the creation of additional affordable housing through limited equities? I would say that in the post-COVID environment, I think to no surprise, things are going to be different. I think a lot of real estate will be repositioned or redeveloped. Cities in particular, particularly central business districts, may be transformed. And how will they be transformed? Do we transform them back into a similar environment we had before COVID, or do we want to build better? And I would argue that everyone on this call would like to build better and build more equitable and inclusive communities focused on affordable housing. And I think co-ops have a very big part to play in that new, better environment. So housing co-ops strengthen communities through ownership, care for the community. The metrics I just talked about in terms of the performance, it proves to be a more resilient ownership structure, a more resilient housing structure. And I think every city, state, and municipality right now is looking for resilient models that can withstand disruption to the day-to-day that we get comfortable with. I think that co-ops can really anchor some of those communities. And so, looking on the horizon, how can we really move the needle on these co-ops being created? There are a couple different congressional matters that are being discussed that we could really attach to. One, there's a discussion of a cooperative bill, a large, impactful cooperative bill that is being sponsored by certain members of Congress. NCBA is in close contact with that staff, and looking for good, strong ideas to really promote cooperatives. Not just housing; they're focused on small business and other types of cooperatives. So a real great opportunity that there's congressional interest in the model. There's an infrastructure bill that I think the Biden administration will be looking to move early on in the administration days. And could be an opportunity for cooperative structures there. I would mention transportation. A lot of the municipal subways and metros and buses and trains, they serve that outer second rung, third rung community outside of a city, and that's where a lot of housing co-ops exist. So that transportation focus is key. And then Doug, I'll finish up a couple of I think any solution will be more than federal, it'll be state and local. Low interest rate loans, preference to Section 8 for limited equity housing loans, co-ops, grant support for early phase projects, and technical support. That's it cannot be understated. As one of the other panelists mentioned, the technical assistance is critical in these early co-ops. Thanks, Doug.
Hey, Casey, that was an excellent presentation. I think you really kind of lifted the curtain on some of the mystery and how co-ops are really similar but different in some important ways. And I really appreciate you moving into the policy conversation. I'm going to invite the rest of the panelists to turn your camera back on. Come on back. We've got 10 minutes or more. Some great questions and comments that have come in through the chat box, and I'm going to give all the panelists. I got one quick comment, but I'm going to give all the panelists a heads up that we're going to start with a round robin on policy. If there are one or two particular policy strategies at the federal level or state or local that you think are critical for people to be able to access the cooperative business model as a housing solution. I think Casey just gave us a couple key ones there, and you can add your check mark next to one of those if you think is key. Also, a number of questions here about materials available. Will they be available? The answer is absolutely yes. We will have. We're going to gather those materials. I know Andy mentioned the research that UHAB has done on limited equity housing, cooperative housing across the country. We'll make sure we gather those resources. If any of the other panelists have resources that you'd like to offer, then when we do a wrap-up email, we'll send it back out to everyone who registered for this webinar. And we're recording this webinar. We welcome. There's a number of congressional staffers that are on, but it's a very busy week in Congress, and we're going to be sending this back out to them as well. So let's turn. I think I can capture a number of the questions on it. It's that policy question. Casey, I think you mentioned a couple. Andy or Danielle or Kim, ideas on key policy tactics. Andy, you got your hand up.
Right. Well, there are two areas that I'd like to mention very briefly. One is that co-ops in a number of laws, federal laws by federal agencies, FEMA, Veterans Administration, and Small Business, SBA, PPPs, housing co-ops weren't eligible for PPPs. They're not eligible as housing under FEMA when New York City was flooded under Sandy. It was a big surprise for 13 of our co-ops that were underwater that they don't count as housing. And that the Veterans Administration doesn't allow veterans to use their loans, home purchase loans, for buying co-ops. Although there's bills in various places in Congress to correct this, but it hasn't been corrected. So we just need to keep the point on. And then the other thing that as I went through my presentation, half of the units that I mentioned, 166,000 units, more than half, 57%, are going to expire. And it doesn't mean they won't stay affordable co-ops, but when they're community gentrifies, or when, as we saw in other places, cost of housing goes way up, cost of those shares can go up. And we really think that the federal government or local state governments should be providing incentives to new loans, tax abatements, whatever it takes to capture that 80,000-90,000 units of housing and keep it. It's the easiest housing, affordable housing to create is the stuff you've already built.
Right. Good. Great suggestions. Thank you, Andy. Danielle or Kim?
I think for us specifically, we're looking for the possibility of reinstating some of that funding that originally got us going at the federal level. It was for university-based housing, and if you look at what was done by universities and then what was done by cooperatives, we have made a lot more of that money and used it in a much better way. So that would be really wonderful to preserve the housing that we have and not lose that. And I think Andy kind of mentioned it, just like a greater understanding, like an information campaign at the policy level. And I don't know exactly what that means, but there's so many barriers on accident. So maybe that would be what I would say for you.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you. Danielle, do you have anything to add?
Yes. So for our resident-owned communities program here in Montana, we have a tax incentive for folks who sell their property to the residents. They are able to pay less capital gains on their state taxes. So if there was something at the federal level that incentivized selling your property to the residents, that would be extremely helpful. Another piece is, we've worked on this in a few places. The Montana Housing Coalition here in Montana is working to get opportunity to purchase legislation in place here in Montana. If something could be federal, that would be amazing as well, but it really makes a requirement that an owner of a manufactured housing community must notify the residents of their intention to sell and give them a period of time to offer on a purchase as well.
That's fantastic. Those are great. Those are really great examples. And we're almost at time. I just want to let folks know that we will be capturing these questions, and we'll kind of assign them out to the panelists, and then we're going to capture and provide kind of a readout to get many of these answered that we just don't have time today. I do want to welcome, I know there's a number of staff from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Of course, they have a very significant housing program for rural communities. And I'll just mention, kind of align to some of the questions that Kate Latour, our Director of Government Relations, and I and others have been working across the cooperative community with HUD, suggesting, to the transition team that in documents that it's time for HUD to build their capacity back up to support cooperative housing. Certainly that issue that Andy talked about with the VA as well as FEMA, those are things that we've been also advocating. We look forward to working across the cooperative community. I really do think that 2021 is going to be a very significant year with that potential, kind of that cooperative moment that Kim talked about, for policymakers to empower people to use cooperatives to deal with the affordable housing crisis. So this last question, it's going to be the out question, but it has to do with really the cooperative identity. And the person asked that they've seen some movement in the cooperative space around really recognizing diversity, equity, and inclusion within the cooperative identity. In credit union world, they've advocated for the idea of an 8th cooperative principle. In October of 2019, the board of NCBA CLUSA made clear that we're working with the International Cooperative Alliance to make DEI more express and understood within the cooperative identity. So just kind of the question, what does diversity, equity, inclusion, what does that mean in terms of the cooperative identity within housing? What does it mean today and what could it mean for the future? So that's a jump ball of, see if anybody had, in Casey, you alluded to it in your comments. Of course, I think it's just sort of kind of built into pretty much everything that everybody talked about today, but I just wanted to bring that out expressly.
I feel like the co-op communities does have sort of a head start on that. I think that so many cooperatives make that core to their mission. I think it grows out of the principles, and where it's added as the fact that it's being discussed as added as a new principle is, I think, an example of that. So I think it's a natural extension of the co-op community.
Thank you, Casey.
We've been in our work recently. We actually had some archivists who did a show in a gallery about the sort of history of our co-op community. And one of the things in putting it together say, mapped our buildings on the old 1930s, 40s redlining maps of New York City, and to see the coincidence of where New York City's abandoned property is to where the red lines were, was just sort of eye-opening. And
Wow.
it sort of, in a way, gave us a starting point to begin the conversation and say, this isn't, it isn't new, and it isn't sort of by accident. It isn't by the sort of economic problems of cities in the 70s. This started in the 30s, and what can we learn about it? And, what can we do about it? And how can we work to overcome what's still built in, the redlining that still goes on, and the systemic racism that we see. And so we, both internally and then across our co-ops, are trying to have those conversations and sort of take this moment when it's easier to have the conversations and go forward.
That's a fascinating history, and it's so relevant to today's context. Andy, thanks for bringing that up. Kim or Danielle?
I would say I also love that the cooperative world is beginning to examine this, because so many folks think that it is just baked in and it is just assumed. But I think that questioning our assumptions and making sure that we're living up to that is so very important. And I would like to refer back to principle number 5, education, training, and information. A lot of times in this co-op world, it seems like preaching to the choir, like once you know. But so really making sure that we're meeting people where they are and giving them the information and education that they need to make the cooperative business model work for them.
Thank you. That's a great comment. Thanks, Kim. Danielle, anything to add?
Just I'll piggyback on that with Kim. We get to offer 2 different leadership summits every year to all of our residents, and we're able to do that with full scholarships. So we try to reduce all the barriers for that, and that really is, I think, the best part of my job is providing that education and getting to see the knowledge growth that takes place, and it's a lot of fun. So we're very lucky to be able to do that.
Danielle, I think that's a great final comment. Andy mentioned before that through his decades of work and UHAB's work over the years, that they found really they're in the people development business. We're talking about housing co-ops, obviously, and we're talking about how the cooperative business model can help meet the affordable housing crisis. But at the end of the day, and it's because it's co-ops and it's the people who live in the co-ops are going to manage the co-ops. They're going to govern the co-ops. Obviously, they're going to live in those co-ops. This is really about empowering people and providing them the tools to take care of one of their most essential needs, and that's housing for them and their families. So, thank you, everyone. Again, we're going to gather the resources, and we'll have a wrap-up email that's going to go out to everybody who has registered today. Really want to thank every one of the panelists, and I hope everybody is safe and healthy as we end up 2020, and happy 2021 as it comes. So thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.